It's with great pleasure that I introduce our Maxwell spheres. A further question concerning technology, the essence of writing.
First and foremost, writing is a technology. It is an instrument brought into existence by human beings, and it is a modification of language in its spoken form. It is my contention that as a technological modification of language, writing conditions human thought. Yet this fundamental and thought-changing technology is often overlooked. It has taken on the character of a pair of glasses. Writing is that through which one sees, but also that which is not itself seen. In its power to change thought, writing conditions that which appears. Given its status, writing must be interrogated to come to an understanding of what it is, that is, what its essence is. In attempting to answer the question of the essence of the technology of writing, I will follow a general line of thought somewhat parallel, not just somewhat, parallel to Martin Heidegger's investigation in the question concerning technology, which from here on I'll just refer to as the question. I will also draw on the work of Eric A. Havelock in his book, The Preface to Plato, and Walter J. in his work Orality and Literacy, in order to bring out writing's essence and the ways in which it conditions that which appears. By answering these questions, I will illuminate not only writing itself, but also the ways in which its force was concealed from Heidegger's keen and unconcealing eye. Allow me to begin with a brief discussion of how I will understand essence in this paper. Essence is often thought of as the whatness of something. This is what Heidegger calls the correct understanding of essence. The correct understanding is not the essence that I'm searching for, although it begins to lead the way to the sense of essence that I'm after. The essence that I want to bring out is the same type of essence that Heidegger looks for in the question. Instead of the whatness or Latin quidditas of a thing as merely a derivative type of essence, Heidegger is looking for a more fundamental essence in the sense of, quoting David Krell, the way in which something pursues its course, the way in which it remains through time as what it is, end quote. So originally, essence is the way that something endures as presence, or rather the way in which it endures and comes to presence. Moreover, a thing's essence is also the way in which it discloses being. As stated above, the true essence of anything, in our case writing, must be sought through the correct essence or whatness of that thing. Thus, the what of writing must be laid bare. And as stated already, we must understand that it is first of all a technology, and more specifically a technological modification of language in its originary oral form. And language itself conditions all of our thought and revealing to some extent. I think a brief moment of introspection shows this, as each and all of our thoughts are structured through language. Stated more simply, we think in our native language, or at least some language that we know. This must be kept in mind because writing, as a modification of language, will also modify thought and revealing. In characterizing technology in general, Heidegger says that it is, quote, a means to an end, a human activity, and also a contrivance. I want to focus on the last of these characteristics. Contrivance here is the translation of the Latin instrumentum, which has connotations of arrangement, adjustment, or equipment. These words begin to hint at the correct essence of writing. In its whatness, writing is equipment that adjusts and arranges. We must now ask, in what ways does it arrange and adjust? It is in Ong's work that we find an answer to this question. As he points out, writing is the act of, quote, committing the spoken word to visual space, end quote. In a purely oral setting, words are spoken utterances that are themselves lived occurrences or events. As such, they take place within time, in a rich, lived context, and they are conditioned by sound. In this way, the spoken word is more of a mode of action, whereas the written word is mostly a, quoting Ong again, countersign of thought. Countersign basically just being counterpart, I think is what he means. Writing enacts a transformation of, quoting Ong again, the evanescent world of sound to the quiescent, quasi-permanent world of space, end quote. And in doing so, it arranges and adjusts human thought into this world of space. In order to see the effects of this adjustment of the word to space, I must turn back to Heidegger. It is important to note that all technology belongs within the sense of the Greek techne, which as Heidegger explains is a mode of bringing forth. As such, technology is always a mode of revealing. Further, As a type of revealing, it's intimately linked to episteme or knowledge, since what one can know must first be revealed. Moreover, writing has a further connection to revealing through its intimate relationship with language. Heidegger insinuates this in the question with his discussion of the Greek verb legein, to say, and logos, which as we know has many different translations, some of which speech, word, reason, or account. These two terms are related to the Greek apophaniste, which is to bring forward into appearance. As such, legein and logos, which are both originally terms for spoken language, are modes of revealing as a bringing forth into appearance. And writing is essentially a technological modification on the original and oral mode of revealing that belongs to these terms. In a non-Heideggerian sense, this amounts to saying that language conditions what types of thinking can be done, and determines, quoting Ong, the way in which experience is intellectually organized, end quote. Thus, in terms of the whatness of writing, we can say that it arranges and adjusts our thought, that it conditions new modes of revealing, and as techne is essentially connected to bringing forth and revealing. I will now turn to how all of this actually takes place and how it conditions all of these things. First of all, writing as the commitment of the spoken word to visual space is a further level of symbolization beyond the spoken word. Oral utterances are themselves representations of entities within the world, and written words are not on this same level of abstraction. Rather, the written words are representations of those spoken words, and not just representations of the things in the world. As such, writing is what Ong calls a secondary modeling system, whereas language in its spoken form is a primary modeling system. Ong explains, quoting him, "Thought is nested in speech, not in texts, all of which have their meanings through reference of the visible symbol to the world of sound. What the reader is seeing on this page are not real words, but coded symbols whereby a properly informed human being can evoke in his or her consciousness real words and actual or imagined sound." End quote. This is an important insight because writing's mode of revealing will carry with it the further distancing from our experience of the world. Writing makes revealing itself more distanced from the interactive, lived world, and it makes what appears more symbolic and abstract. Through this further level of removal from one's interactive experience of the world, writing creates a new sort of discourse that is, as Ong calls it, context-free or autonomous. Autonomous not being like Kantian autonomy, but just standing alone. Writing makes language and the thoughts expressed in it autonomous, standing alone, as ripped from the interactively lived context of orality, and placed in the timelessness of the written word. Further, it allows an individual person to effectively be their own interlocutor, such that sustained thought can take place in a completely solitary setting, which is sort of a big deal in just the history of writing. How is thought and revealing affected by this further level of detachment from a more interactive lived experience? What now reveals itself? I'm in full agreement with Ong that this detachment makes words more thing-like, and as such puts more of an emphasis on discrete individual entities. What writing does is to give words a visual presence, and as such it shifts human thought and language out of the sound-oriented world of orality to the visually oriented world of literacy. This new focus on sight has had a profound impact on thought. As Ong points out, sight focuses on isolation, whereas sound relies on incorporation. Also, sight situates the observer outside of what is seen and puts them at a distance from the thing that is viewed. What specific effects does this have? I think there are two main effects that the thing-like nature of written words and this new emphasis on vision have for thought and revealing. First of all, with writing and its isolating tendencies, the new ideal for coming to know something is clarity, as opposed to the old oral ideal of harmony. The ideal of vision is to observe something or entity as static, motionless, and in complete isolation. In the oral tradition, there was a manifold from one's existential context that was taken in at once, but the new literate ideal is to weed out most of the manifold aspects of experience so as to ensnare an object in a still setting and observe it from all angles. The context itself must be concealed so as to isolate what is being viewed. What this does is it makes one interpret the world and the entities within it in a more thing-like manner. As words are understood as discrete visual entities, the things that the words represent are interpreted in the same way. As Eric Havelock states in his preface to Plato on this same point, quote, "Here then is the concept of an object, fiercely isolated from time, place, and circumstance, and translated linguistically into abstraction, and then put forward as the goal of a prolonged intellectual investigation." End quote. Instead of the richness and manifoldness of an oral context, one has individual, static, discrete entities or objects that are brought forth into appearance. This new emphasis on sight places the individual observer in a new relation to the world. This is the second effect of the thing-like status of the written word. Instead of being the auditory center of an oral world and context, the sight-oriented literate person is placed in a one-to-one relation to these static objects. The object is revealed as a discrete and present thing, and the observer is revealed as similar in its discreteness and presence. A discrete subject who observes is identified, and this subject, like the objects, can now be viewed apart from the context it exists in. Further, not only does writing's new emphasis on vision enact this new sort of relation, but also the act of writing itself helps to do this. As Ong points out, quote, "Writing and reading are solitary activities that throw the psyche back on itself," end quote. In speech, an interlocutor is absolutely necessary for sustained thought. However, writing is done as a mostly solipsistic activity, and as such it makes a person her own interlocutor for sustained thought. Not only that, but the visual preservation of the word that writing affords allows one to go back over what thoughts they have written out and correct or adjust them at will. This sets up a new interiority that helps to develop what has come to be known as subjectivity. Havelock echoes these same claims about subjectivity when he is discussing Plato and his doctrine of the soul. According to Havelock, the literate tradition that Plato was ushering in transformed the way that people thought about their own identity. Havelock explains that the understanding of one's soul or psyche changed so that, quoting Havelock, "Instead of signifying a man's ghost or wraith, or a man's breath or his lifeblood, a thing devoid of sense and self-consciousness, it came to mean the ghost that thinks, that is capable both of moral decision and of scientific cognition, and is the seat of moral responsibility, something infinitely precious, an essence unique in the whole realm of nature." End quote. Instead of identifying oneself with the oral tradition, people began to conceive of themselves as unique individual subjects that think. As Havelock explains, the oral tradition relies on self-surrender to the poetic experience and oral tradition. However, this is done away with through the rise of literacy, as the conditions for subjectivity are established through and made possible by writing. So writing makes words more thing-like. This new thing-like status of words is then reflected in the way in which one views the world and the entities within it that the words represent. The world is represented through writing in terms of discrete objects, and this isolation of objects conceals the rich, manifold, and interactive context of the world one experiences. This is to say that writing brings forth, that is, reveals, discrete entities within the world as merely present. These visual objects are isolated from their context, their actions, and the feelings they evoke in the observer. They become abstracted from everything except their mere presence and appearing. Also, the new visual focus that is brought on by writing furthers this isolation of discrete objects, and it establishes a distinct and isolated subject that views them. All the characteristics and descriptions of writing and its effects have helped us to travel down the path towards writing's true essence. What essence is to be found here? What is revealed through the correct essence of writing, on our way now to the true essence, is the conditions for objectivity. That is, a distinct subject and discrete objects out in the world that are merely present, or to use Heidegger's term, merely present at hand, as modified out of their originary ready-to-hand appearance. We have now arrived at the true essence of the technology of writing. The true essence of writing is the revealing or disclosure of entities within the world as present at hand. In fact, this act of bringing forth objects as merely present at hand happens literally at the location of the hand. When the hand, in its activity, writes the word and preserves it in visual space, the entire process of objectification has been set in motion. The hand is what first makes writing possible, and once it has begun to write, the old oral mode of revealing has already begun to be replaced. So it is that the modification out of ready-to-handness and into present-at-handness actually takes place at the hand, that is, when the writing utensil meets its surface. As Heidegger points out in his lecture series on Parmenides, quoting Heidegger, the hand exists as hand only where there is disclosure and concealment, end quote. As I have shown above, writing is itself a mode of disclosure, that is revealing, and as such is essentially tied to concealing. Writing not only conceals the oral existential context within which spoken words are uttered, but also conceals orality itself and its modes of disclosure. In fact, it does so in a way analogous to what Heidegger has to say about the typewriter. Heidegger, in speaking of the typewriter, says that this machine, quote, tears writing from the essential realm of the hand, end quote. But what was concealed from Heidegger himself is that writing is already an act of tearing language and the spoken word out of the essential realm of mouth and body. The typewriter conceals handwriting, yet handwriting conceals the spoken word. Even Havelock noticed this concealing power of writing when he states, quote, "It does not occur to us that once upon a time it was necessary for it to have been discovered and defined and insisted on, so that we could easily and complacently inherit it being writing." End quote. Writing traps the spoken word in visual space, and in doing so conceals its own concealing act from us. With this in mind, we can now view one of Heidegger's quotes on the typewriter as having the same force when thought about in terms of writing. So in the first line here, Heidegger's talking about the cloud, and the cloud, as most of us probably know, is lethe, concealment, oblivion. And so quoting Heidegger on the typewriter, he said, he says, "Therefore the cloud, within action, leads the way astray, leads outside of what the thinking ahead, the reflecting, and the commemorating provide when they are guided by awe. Transposed into concealment as such a darkening, man stands in a certain way outside of what is unconcealed." Writing as an action of the hand enacts a new and derivative mode of revealing that presents the world as full of discrete objects there for one's visual inspection, and in doing so conceals the spoken word in the rich existential context that the spoken word needs to survive and to have its significance. That is to say, it places us at a distance or outside of what is unconcealed. And so from what has been laid out above, right, we can see that the true essence of writing has made itself clear. It starts with the idea that language conditions all thought. Writing as a technological modification of language is thus also a modification of thought. Writing pulls words out of their rich and full existential context, thus making them thing-like, and this places a new emphasis on vision instead of sound. And once the visually oriented thing-like interpretation of words has been interiorized, it becomes the way that human beings interpret the things in the world that the words represent. As a result, entities within the world are revealed just like the written words themselves, and the context that surrounds and situates these entities is concealed. The entities themselves are then revealed as objects. This modification is a shift from ready-to-hand interpretations of entities to the present-at-hand interpretation that spawns our ideas of objectivity. Also, this shift to the present-at-hand literally takes place at the hand. From this, it is clear that the essence of writing, that is its mode of disclosure, the way in which it endures in presences, is precisely the disclosure of entities as present at hand. Thank you. Here and then Rich and Ray.
I might misunderstood you already, but just so writing kind of objectifies things, it represents them as things, as things, as like discrete. So, and especially writing as technology and typewriter, I'm just thinking about like non-representative forms of writing, like Maloney's experimentations with typography, and literally technology of writing, and yeah, that is deliberately non-representative, non-objectifying. Just how does that work in relation to this reading of writing technology?
I don't know yet, but I think it's really, really cool, and I think it's just historically sort of a newer thing that people are doing with writing, and really trying to make a conscious effort to be non-representative in the way that they're using it.
Poetry from
Like Apollinaire?
Yeah, that's still pretty new in the 2,600-year history of writing, back at our thought. So I don't know exactly how that fits in, but I think that something that's really interesting about that is the way in which people wholly within a literate culture are, without maybe even explicitly, trying to do things with writing that go against sort of the structures that writing has put in place, which I think is really interesting. I mean, to some extent, I think that's what Heidegger is doing in Being and Time or something like that, right? Is trying to get outside of the literate modes of thought while doing it through literacy. So I don't know if that sort of addresses. Basically, I don't know yet, but I think it's really cool. To Richard in the back.
I was thinking on a lot of issues, truth and lies, and narrative, of course. But I guess I got to think it's with the end of your essay here. You talk about the question concerning technology, and it seems like if you take writing to where it's going to come to, you think about opportunity, you think about everything being textual and graphic. And you didn't make a connection of the idea of how that might fit into the idea of Heidegger's expanding observe, which I thought would be kind of like almost like an end product of this. Everything's now just kind of, everything is at hand, everything can be just kind of dredged up, and writing's kind of made as possible, it's kind of crystal graphic, but everything there at our disposal, So it is kind of the embodiment of technology in that sense. In a disembodied kind of way, obviously, right? We're talking about phenomenology embodiment, what it does, but very embodied power.
I mean, I would agree, and I think that the standing reserve and Gestalt in general are sort of the next thing I need to do with this project in general. But I think that they're very much related and can fit in with some of the things that I'm saying about writing. Just that writing just sort of historically comes first, because as far as I read it, I don't think Heidegger is actually doing the question concerning technology in general. I think Heidegger is doing the question concerning thermodynamic technology. And that's why I see the importance of doing these types of projects first. Okay, if there can be an essence of thermodynamic technology that reveals a certain aspect of the world to us, I think that's great and that's really interesting, but then that means that there's essences of other types of technologies. Because as Heidegger himself is doing, I don't think he's doing technology in general. I think it's just thermodynamic technology. Gray jacket here, and then up front, and then to the back.
So,
If we have time.
I guess I've heard this idea of the primacy of oral language from Chomsky, these kind of linguistic traditions that come from there. But what I keep having in mind, and what keeps bothering me, is that I feel like this is another reincarnation of the noble savage. So the fact that writing comes about later doesn't necessarily seem to suggest to me that oral tradition itself is not a kind of technology in itself, or perhaps that neither are, but that there's a kind of a presencing of them out of the general horizon, that perhaps we're, in our attention to them, we're solidifying them as objects in some sense this need to be done.
Is there a question? I mean, I basically agree with you. This is just, it's sort of a historical point. People didn't have writing, and then people had writing. Right? I don't want to get into noble savage ideas. I don't even really want to make evaluative claims about which one's better, or which mode of disclosure is getting us closer to the truth, or something like that. It's just that at one point people didn't have writing, at another point people had writing. It seems like once writing came about, people started to think about things differently. And that's evidenced with Plato and the way in which he ushers in a different way of doing metaphysics, basically. Does that speak to your comment?
I guess I'm concerned that your argument is it presumes that so if writing is insofar as your argument presumes a primacy to oral tradition, it seems, or at least oral communication, it does. I'm not understanding how it seems such an integral aspect of your argument that I guess it is a concern of mine.
I'm not seeing, I mean, what's the concern? That orality came first, or that the way I'm treating it? I'm just...
Yes, in that, your argument seems to me that when we start writing, so these conditions are thought, and I'm not disagree with that in the least bit. But my issue is that your argument is that in the visual space that we end up objectifying the words themselves, and that this is doing something different than what we're doing when we're speaking. But I'm wondering if we're actually doing the same thing when we're speaking. It's just that we're paying more attention to the writing because this historically helps later.
Yeah, I think that's a good worry. I disagree with you, but I think it's a good worry and something I need to work out in the longer version of the paper.
Just one.
Sure.
I guess I guess I want to offer a critique that is maybe a kind of a Heideggerian critique of this. So the kind of the essence that you kind of extract from writing is this idea of the present hand. You use language like a turn to vision, to viewing things as discrete things, and at one point you refer to this as kind of, in a certain sense, causally connected to the emergence of the unique individual subject who thinks. At one point you use that phrase. And I guess my concern is that this all sounds very, very modern. So I'm thinking, for example...
How are you using modern first before you go?
I mean, I'm thinking like, for instance, Kant. So this, I'll get to why I think this is a critique. In the sense that it, you talk about space as kind of stable and time as kind of, that the oral nature of time is kind of flowing. And this sounds, like very much like the way Kant will speak about time in his critique of the paralogisms. And so my concern about this is that Kant is a long time after writing. Writing has been going for quite a bit. So my concern is that if writing was the thing that kind of instituted this turn to vision, this turn to presence at hand, this turn to discrete things, then why does it take so long? And so for these to kind of enter as the way of thinking. And so it makes me think of like kind of the epical analysis of the history of being that somebody like Heidegger will offer, where he'll talk about the Greek notion of phusis, which is very much not an idea of discrete things, or the medieval notion of creation, things as created by God. And so my concern is that it seems that what you're describing as an essence of writing is particularly modern, but writing isn't particularly modern, and that kind of concerns me.
No, I think that's a really good worry. So I would say just sort of speculating a little bit, and this is something I've thought about. Basically, to be able to take literate thought with what I'm trying to say from the point at which, because it's not just when writing comes about, it's when literacy actually becomes an important part of culture and starts to be dispersed into a greater population. But I mean, it's really hard to do all of the metaphysical work to get from Plato to Kant, and I think that's part of the reason it takes so long. I think Kant is able to give us sort of a system that I think could be read as like literate thought par excellence, but he's only able to do that because of all the other work that everybody else has done to him. I don't think it's a particularly Kantian or modern thing.
So would you
Because there's still, substance ontology, it's sort of the history of Western philosophy, and other than a few what get considered like heretical thinkers, it's basically about discrete things and objects.
So would you see like sort of this like kind of Kantian modernism as kind of becoming inevitable once writing is instituted?
I'm going to remain agnostic on that. That's too much.